I need clarity, Denise. I'm just not sure anymore. When my fiancé Julian uttered those words 3 weeks before our wedding, the world didn't stop. It grew ice cold. There were no tears, no screaming. As a career coach who has helped hundreds of women rebuild their lives after betrayal, I knew that look. It wasn't the look of a man who was confused. It was the look of a man who had already moved on but hadn't found the courage to tell me. I chose to respect his uncertainty. I stayed silent, moved into the guest room, and prepared to grieve. But then my doorbell camera pinged at 2:00 a.m. I didn't see a man seeking clarity. I saw a man handing over a floral arrangement contract to a woman who wasn't me. I saw him kissing her on my doorstep and whispering the most devastating words imaginable. "Don't worry, everything is on track for our big day. She has no idea." He wasn't postponing our wedding. He was stealing it. He was using my $300,000 budget, my elite reputation, and my venue to marry someone else on our original date. He thought my maturity was his safety net. He thought I was too classy to fight back. He was wrong. By the time you finish this story, you will see exactly how I turned that $300,000 contract into a legal noose and played that footage in a room full of the people he most feared. This isn't just a story of betrayal. It is a masterclass in how a woman of dignity burns a bridge so thoroughly that the person who crossed it has nowhere left to run. Stick around, because the look on his face when the screen flickers to life is something you have to see to believe. My name is Denise, and at 38, I have spent over a decade establishing myself as a high-level career coach, specializing in helping women navigate the treacherous waters of professional reinvention and personal recovery after devastating life shifts. I built my life on the foundations of logic, resilience, and an unwavering belief that a woman's value is never determined by the man standing beside her, but by the strength of her own character. I had spent my late 20s and early 30s focused entirely on my ascent content in my success and my quiet, elegant home in the suburbs of Connecticut until I met Julian. He was 40, brilliant, but struggling when we first met, and I spent years helping him rebuild his confidence and his consulting firm into the powerhouse it is today. I thought we were a team, two professionals at the peak of our lives, building a legacy together, until the night the air in our living room turned to ice. The evening started like any other, with the soft clink of silverware and the scent of expensive wine, until Julian set his glass down and refused to look me in the eye. He didn't raise his voice. In fact, he spoke with a practiced, gentle tone that made the betrayal feel even more clinical. He told me he wanted to postpone the wedding. It was only 3 weeks away. The invitations were out, the deposits were paid, and the floral arrangements had already been finalized. As he spoke, I didn't feel the urge to scream or the desperate need to beg for an explanation. Instead, my professional brain took over. I sat back in my velvet armchair and listened to the vocabulary of his cowardice. He used all the classic vague phrases I had coached countless women to recognize. "I need to find clarity, Denise. I don't want us to rush into something we aren't ready for. I just need some space to breathe." I watched him carefully, noting the way he leaned into the word clarity as if it were a shield. It is a psychological trick often used on women like me, successful, composed, and self-reliant, banking on our fear of being perceived as the desperate bride or the woman who forces a commitment. He wanted me to be the one to back off, to offer him grace, and to tell him it was okay to take his time. He was betting on my maturity to protect his own indecision. But as a coach, I knew better. In my world, when a man says he is unsure, so close to a deadline, it usually means he is very sure about something else, but hasn't yet secured the exit ramp. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a scene. I simply nodded, my face a mask of professional calm, and said, "If you are not certain, Julian, then a postponement is the only logical choice. I will not be a woman who drags a reluctant man to the altar." The look of relief that washed over his face was my first real confirmation that this wasn't about cold feet. It was a tactical maneuver. My silence wasn't born of naivety or weakness. It was a tactical observation period. I have learned over the years that if you give a person enough rope and enough silence, they will eventually show you exactly who they are. While he spent the next few days acting like a man burdened by a heavy soul, I was mentally auditing our lives. I had invested more than just emotion into this union. I had invested my social capital and my financial security. At 38, I wasn't some wide-eyed girl blinded by a fairy tale. I was a woman managing a $300,000 social and financial contract. We had booked a historic estate in the Hudson Valley, a venue that usually required a 2-year waiting list. We had a guest list of 200 people, including CEOs, judges, and high-profile clients who saw our marriage as the ultimate power coupling of the industry. Beyond the aesthetics, there was the legal merging of our assets. I had already begun the process of integrating our professional networks, allowing him access to my elite inner circle people who only took his calls because they trusted my judgment. As I looked at the shimmering white Vera Wang gown hanging in the back of my closet, I didn't see a symbol of romance. I saw a breached contract. Julian wasn't just asking for time. He was stalling a massive, multifaceted merger that involved hundreds of people and a small fortune of my hard-earned money. His uncertainty felt less like a heart in turmoil and more like a calculated white-collar crime. Every time he walked past me in the hallway, looking solemn and thoughtful, I felt a deep, quiet resolve hardening inside me. I was watching him, waiting for the one slip-up that would reveal the truth behind his sudden need for space. I chose to play the part of the understanding, dignified partner, giving him all the space he asked for because I knew that in the silence, the truth always finds a way to scream. I respected his uncertainty. What I didn't know was that his hesitation already had a destination. In the days that followed Julian's request for a postponement, I found myself existing in a state of hypervigilance that only a woman trained in corporate strategy could maintain. I didn't retreat into the bedroom to cry. Instead, I moved through our home like a ghost in my own life, watching the man I thought I knew transform into a stranger before my eyes. The most striking thing about Julian's uncertainty was how incredibly productive it seemed to make him. A man who is truly struggling with the weight of a life-altering commitment usually slows down. He becomes contemplative, perhaps a bit lethargic, as he wrestles with the gravity of his choices. But Julian was sprinting. He was suddenly busier than he had been in the 3 years I'd known him, leaving the house before sunrise and returning long after I had finished my solitary dinner. He was oddly protective of his schedule, snapping his laptop shut whenever I entered the room and keeping his phone face down on every surface. I watched him from across the kitchen island, noting the manic energy in his movements, and I realized with a sinking feeling that he didn't act like a man trying to save a relationship. He acted like someone who had successfully cleared a major obstacle and was now rushing toward a finish line I couldn't yet see. The postponement hadn't been a pause for reflection, it had been a clearance for takeoff. The first real crack in his narrative appeared not in his words, but in the digital paper trail of our shared life. As a career coach, I am obsessed with the fine print of contracts, and I know that in the world of high-end luxury events, the word postpone is a legal fiction. You don't simply put a $300,000 wedding on ice without a massive paper trail of cancellations and fee structures. While Julian was out finding clarity, I received an automated email from our luxury stationery vendor. I expected a notification about a stop work order or a credit for future services. Instead, the subject line read, "Final proof approval for date revision." My heart skipped a beat as I opened the attachment. It wasn't a cancellation. It was a thank you note for confirming the updated details for our original date. The vendor wasn't releasing the slot. They were simply waiting for the final print run for a guest list that I hadn't authorized. I sat in my home office, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my glasses, and I felt the first sharp prick of a much larger betrayal. Julian hadn't called off the vendors. He had merely redirected them. My mind began to race, connecting dots I hadn't even known existed. I logged into our joint credit card portal, the one we used for wedding-related expenses, and began scrolling through the recent transactions. There, it was a $3,000 charge for a boutique called The White Rose in downtown Manhattan. I knew that shop. It was an exclusive bridal atelier that specialized in bespoke veils and accessories for last-minute alterations. I hadn't stepped foot in Manhattan in weeks, and I certainly hadn't authorized a purchase there. At 38, I have learned that numbers don't lie, even when people do. If Julian were truly unsure about our future, he wouldn't be authorizing final proofs or buying bridal accessories. He was paying to stay in the game, but he was playing a version of it that didn't include me. The logic of a coach took over. Someone was getting married on my dime at my venue on my date, but the bride's chair was no longer reserved for Denise. The unease became a cold, hard certainty on a Tuesday afternoon when I was working from home. My phone buzzed with a notification from our doorbell camera, a system I had installed months ago for general security. Usually it was just the mailman or a stray cat, but this time I saw Julian's car pull into the driveway. He wasn't alone. A courier was waiting for him, holding a thick, professional-looking folder. I watched the live feed on my phone, my breath catching in my throat, as Julian stepped out and greeted the man with a familiarity that suggested they had met before. My fiancé didn't just take the folder. He handed the courier a stack of my own proprietary business coaching manuals, the ones I had spent a decade perfecting, the ones that held my unique methodology for executive transitions. These were trade secrets, the literal secret sauce of my multi-million-dollar coaching brand. I watched him lean in close to the courier, whispering something while tapping the folder he had just received, which bore the gold leaf logo of our wedding venue's legal department. He wasn't just planning a wedding behind my back, he was engaging in professional espionage. He was trading my intellectual property, my life's work, likely to secure a deal or a sponsorship for his new event. He was using my reputation as collateral to build a future that excluded me. I watched the screen as he walked back into the house. His face set in that same solemn, confused expression he wore whenever he looked at me. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. He wanted me to stay in the house to remain the understanding fiancé while he dismantled my life piece by piece right under my nose. He thought I was too dignified to dig, too classy to check the cameras, and too trusting to audit the accounts. He banked on my professional ethics to keep me quiet while he committed a robbery of both my heart and my career. I closed the app, my hands remarkably steady, and looked out the window at the manicured lawn. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a strategist who had just seen her opponent's entire hand. The mystery of his hesitation was gone, replaced by a much darker reality of calculation and theft. I realized then that the doorbell camera hadn't just caught a delivery. It had caught the moment Julian stopped being my partner and became my mark. I wasn't looking for proof of betrayal. I was trying to understand why nothing felt postponed at all. The transition from suspicion to absolute certainty happened in the dead of night, fueled by the cold blue light of my laptop and a resolve that had long since replaced my grief. After witnessing Julian trade my intellectual property like a common thief on our front porch, I knew the postponement was merely a cloak for a much larger operation. I spent hours bypassing the shared security filters he had recently placed on our wedding planning portal, utilizing an old administrative password the venue manager had given me months ago. When the dashboard finally loaded, I felt a physical jolt of electricity run through my veins. The $300,000 budget was not only active, it was fully reconciled. The historic Hudson Valley estate, the 5-course tasting menu, and the premium open bar were all locked in for our original date. But as I scrolled down to the legal filing section of the digital guest list, the breath left my lungs. My name, Denise Miller, had been meticulously scrubbed from the bride's column in the final vendor manifests. In its place was a name I had never heard: Elena Vance. He wasn't just stalling, he was performing a seamless bride swap. Julian was planning to walk down the aisle I had paid for in the venue I had secured to marry another woman on the very day we were supposed to pledge our lives to one another. He was treating my heart like a distressed asset, and the wedding like a corporate merger he could simply restructure behind my back. I didn't scream, and I didn't wake him. Instead, I spent the next morning utilizing every professional resource at my disposal to track down Elena Vance. My coaching career had gifted me a network of investigators and digital researchers, and within 3 hours, I was sitting in a quiet upscale cafe in a neighboring town, watching a girl who couldn't have been more than 25 sip an iced latte. She looked nothing like the gold digger I had imagined in my darkest thoughts. She looked soft, earnest, and terrifyingly young. When I approached her table and introduced myself not as Julian's fiancé, but as a family representative, her face lit up with a heartbreakingly genuine smile. She told me how excited she was for the wedding and how much she appreciated my generosity. I sat there, my blood turning to ice as she explained the narrative Julian had fed her. According to her, I wasn't his fiancé of 3 years. I was his wealthy, terminally ill aunt who had no children of her own. He told her that my final wish was to see him happily married and that I was gifting them this lavish $300,000 celebration as a legacy before I passed away. He had even told her that I was too fragile to meet her in person until the day of the ceremony. The sheer scale of his sociopathy was breathtaking. He had managed to cast me as a dying benefactor to hide the fact that I was the woman he was currently living with. He was using my impending death as a tool to gain Elena's sympathy while using my actual bank account to fund their new life. Looking at Elena, I realized she wasn't my rival. She was his next victim. She was a younger, more malleable version of who I used to be, someone he could mold and manipulate without the burden of my professional experience or my sharp eye for inconsistencies. This realization shifted something fundamental inside me. The last flickering ember of romantic pain died out, replaced by a cold, industrial resolve. I wasn't just a woman who had been cheated on. I was a woman who had been targeted by a professional predator. The drama of the situation ceased to be a personal tragedy and became a mission of absolute destruction. I saw Julian for what he truly was, an apex narcissist who viewed people as stepping stones. If he wanted to treat our life like a business transaction, I would show him exactly how a seasoned professional handles a hostile takeover. I entered a state of emotional freeze that was as liberating as it was chilling. When I returned home that afternoon, I looked at Julian as he sat in the living room pretending to read a book while looking solemn. I felt nothing, no anger, no urge to confront him, just a clinical need to gather data. I began to treat the end of our relationship like a high-stakes corporate liquidation. Every evening while he thought I was sleeping or finding my own clarity, I was in my office recording our muffled conversations through the vents, taking high-resolution photos of his private journals, and downloading every financial statement from our joint accounts. I contacted my bank to flag every suspicious transaction and began the silent process of rerouting my personal assets into private trusts he couldn't touch. I documented the theft of my coaching manuals and the unauthorized use of my professional credentials with a meticulousness that would hold up in any court of law. I moved through the house with the grace of a predator. I made him dinner, I asked him how he was feeling about his need for space, and I watched him lie to my face with a smoothness that would have been impressive if it weren't so pathetic. Every lie he told became another line in my ledger of his ruin. I realized that confronting him now would be a mistake. A man like Julian thrives on conflict because it allows him to play the victim. If I screamed, he would tell everyone I was unhinged or mentally unstable due to my supposed terminal illness. No, the only way to win was to let him believe his plan was working perfectly until the very second the trap snapped shut. I was no longer a woman waiting for a wedding. I was the architect of a catastrophe he would never see coming. I stopped seeing him as a partner and began seeing him as a liability that needed to be erased from my balance sheet. I felt a strange, soaring sense of power in my detachment. He thought he was playing me, but he was merely a character in a script I was now rewriting in real time. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt informed, and that made all the difference. The sense of empowerment that comes from absolute clarity is far more potent than the rush of romance ever was. With the ghost wedding fully exposed, I didn't waste a single moment on heartbreak. Instead, I sought out Marcus, a high-powered attorney known for dismantling complex financial frauds with the surgical precision of a grand master. As we sat in his mahogany row office, we dissected the $300,000 wedding contracts I had meticulously gathered. It was there that I discovered the true extent of Julian's audacity. He hadn't just used my money, he had leveraged my professional credentials to secure celebrity discounts and industry influencer perks that were reserved exclusively for my coaching brand. By signing these contracts under the guise of our joint venture, he had inadvertently committed a sophisticated form of professional fraud. Marcus pointed out that Julian had essentially used my reputation as collateral for a lifestyle he couldn't afford. However, instead of canceling the contracts and losing the deposits, we executed a much more satisfying maneuver. We utilized a specific clause regarding the primary guarantor. Since I was the one who had provided the initial proof of funds, I had the legal authority to restructure the payment obligations. I didn't shut the event down. I simply quietly and legally transferred every cent of the remaining liabilities and the ballooning final payments into Julian's name only. I kept the keys to the venue and the vendor portal, but the massive debt that was about to fall was now tied exclusively to his Social Security number. I was still the architect of the event, but he was now its sole financier, whether he knew it or not. While the legal trap was being set, I turned my attention to his professional parasitic behavior. I had spent 15 years building an elite network of high-net-worth individuals, executives, and mentors who trusted my word implicitly. Through my silent audit, I began to uncover that Julian had been treating my contact list like an all-you-can-eat buffet. He had been reaching out to my most valued associates, promising them exclusive family access and partnership opportunities that would supposedly solidify after our wedding. He was selling his proximity to me as a commodity, using our impending union to grift investments for his failing consulting firm. It was a house of cards built entirely on the foundation of my credibility. I didn't make a public scene. I simply made a series of discreet professional phone calls. To each contact, I spoke with the calm, measured tone of a woman who was simply updating her professional portfolio. I informed them that Julian no longer represented my interests and that any future ventures involving him would be entirely independent of my brand. I watched the digital dominoes fall as one by one his investors began to ghost his calls and withdraw their tentative offers. I was effectively cutting off his oxygen supply, leaving him to suffocate in the silence of a collapsing reputation, all while he still believed he was weeks away from his big bride swap triumph. The final piece of the strategy required me to face Elena Vance one last time. I met her in a secluded corner of a park, far from the prying eyes of the Hudson Valley social circle. This time, I didn't come as a family representative. I came as the woman who held the deed to her future. I laid out the folders on the stone bench between us, the financial statements showing the $300,000 debt I had just transferred to Julian, the legal documents proving he had stolen my intellectual property, and the evidence that I was very much alive and well, not a terminally ill aunt, gifting him a legacy. I watched the color drain from her face as the fantasy Julian had built for her disintegrated in real time. She was young, yes, but she wasn't stupid. She saw the receipts. She saw that she wasn't stepping into a fairy tale. She was being groomed to be the next host for a parasite who was currently drowning in debt. I offered her a choice, but it wasn't the kind of choice she expected. I told her she could either run now and let him find another victim, or she could help me finish what I had started. I told her that she didn't have to be a victim at the altar of a liar. She could be the primary witness to his total and utter public exposure. I spoke to her not as a rival, but as a mentor guiding a younger woman away from the very trap I had almost fallen into. It was a strategic alliance that subverted everything Julian believed about women. He thought we were competitive, emotional, and easily divided. He didn't realize that our collective intelligence was his greatest threat. When I left that park, Elena was no longer crying. She had the same cold, sharp look in her eyes that I saw in the mirror every morning. We had established a timeline, a series of check-ins, and a plan for the big day that Julian was so eagerly anticipating. I returned home to our shared house, finding Julian in the kitchen, pretending to look stressed about his need for clarity. He actually had the nerve to ask me if I was okay with the postponement, his voice dripping with that faux empathy he used so well. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a wave of profound amusement. He thought he was the one in control. He thought he was the one making the difficult decisions, the one managing the two women in his life with the skill of a puppet master. He didn't see the legal noose tightening around his neck, or the way his professional world had already turned into a desert. He saw a 38-year-old woman who was being dignified and mature, and he mistook that grace for a lack of perception. I smiled at him, a genuine, terrifyingly calm smile, and told him that I understood everything perfectly. I told him that I was more sure of our future now than I had ever been. He took it as a sign of my submission. He thought my maturity would protect him. He didn't realize it would expose him. The evening of the rehearsal dinner arrived with a crisp autumnal chill that seemed to mirror the temperature of my own blood. Julian was in high spirits. His uncertainty conveniently vanished now that the big day was within reach. He moved through the gilded ballroom of the Hudson Valley estate with the misplaced confidence of a man who believed he had successfully pulled off the ultimate heist. He thought this was a celebration of his cleverness, a pre-wedding gathering funded by my hard work, but designed to launch his new life with Elena. I had played my part to perfection, inviting not only his conservative family and our shared business associates, but also a group of new friends Julian hadn't officially introduced to me yet, Elena's unsuspecting parents and their closest circle. As the room filled with the scent of lilies and the hum of expensive conversation, Julian squeezed my hand, leaning in to whisper how much he appreciated my understanding during his difficult month. He didn't notice that I didn't squeeze back. He saw a 38-year-old woman in a sleek obsidian silk dress, a sharp contrast to the bridal white everyone expected, and he mistook my composure for a quiet acceptance of my role as the disappearing benefactor. He truly believed he was about to step into a life of luxury and professional prestige, using my reputation as his golden ticket. When the main course was cleared, I rose from my seat at the head of the table. The room dimmed and a hush fell over the guests. Julian gave me a supportive paternalistic nod, clearly expecting a graceful toast from the dying aunt, or the jilted but dignified partner he had coached me to be. I tapped my crystal glass, the sound sharp and final in the quiet room. "I've prepared a special tribute for tonight," I announced, my voice steady and clear, projecting with the authority of a woman who has spent her life commanding boardrooms. A look back at the journey that brought us all to this historic estate. I signaled to the technician at the back of the room, and the massive projection screen flickered to life. The video began with the expected imagery, soft focus photos of Julian and me from 3 years ago, accompanied by a romantic piano score. I watched Julian's face in the glow of the screen. He looked smug, almost bored, as if he were watching a movie he had already seen. But then the music stopped abruptly. The romantic montage cut to grainy high-definition footage from my doorbell camera. The date stamp in the corner was from just 2 weeks ago. The room gasped as the screen showed Julian on our front porch handing over my proprietary coaching manuals to a stranger and whispering about liquidating the assets. The video then transitioned to a recording of a phone call, Julian's voice clear and cold, confirming to the venue manager that the bride's name was to be changed to Elena Vance, but the billing was to remain under my professional account. Then came the most damning footage of all, Julian kissing Elena on my doorstep at 2 a.m., telling her that the old woman inside wouldn't live to see the end of the year and that her money was practically already theirs. The silence that followed was deafening, a thick, suffocating weight that seemed to crush the air out of the room. I didn't look away from him. I watched as the smugness was replaced by a sickly gray pallor. His family looked horrified. Elena's parents looked confused and then enraged, and our business associates began to pull their chairs back from the table as if Julian were suddenly contagious. I let the silence linger until it became unbearable. Julian tried to stand, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, his hands shaking as he reached for a glass of water that he knocked over. "Denise, This is a misunderstanding, a digital manipulation," he stammered, but the words died in his throat. I didn't give him the chance to build a new lie. I walked over to him, my movements slow and deliberate, and placed a thick leather-bound folder on the table in front of him. It hit the wood with a heavy thud. "This isn't a wedding gift, Julian," I said, my voice barely above a whisper yet, carrying to every corner of the room. "Inside, you'll find a formal lawsuit for intellectual property theft and professional fraud. You'll also find the final invoices for this entire event, $300,000 worth of liabilities that are now legally and exclusively tied to your name." I turned to the room, addressing the stunned investors and colleagues who had been prepared to back his next venture. As of this moment, Julian is no longer associated with my brand, my network, or my life. His consulting firm was built on my trade secrets, and his wedding was built on my credit. Neither will survive the night. Julian's face went from pale to a terrifying shade of crimson as he looked around the room and realized there was no exit. He looked at Elena, who was standing by the door with the cold, sharp expression we had practiced in the park, and then back at me. I saw the moment he realized that his maturity trap had become his prison. He had banked on my silence, my need for decorum, and my fear of public embarrassment. He never imagined that I would be the one to orchestrate the very spectacle he tried to hide. I didn't wait for him to respond. I didn't need to hear his excuses or witness his collapse. I had already achieved my objective: absolute public accountability and total financial severance. As I turned to walk out of the ballroom, I heard the first shouts of anger from Elena's father and the frantic questions from Julian's own mother. I walked through the double doors and into the cool night air, leaving the wreckage of his life behind me. The room didn't explode with a bang. It didn't need to. It simply quietly and completely collapsed. The silence that followed the collapse of Julian's world was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. In the months that followed that night in the Hudson Valley, I watched from a distance as the life he had built on my reputation and my resources disintegrated with poetic speed. A narcissist like Julian is nothing without a stage and a benefactor, and I had stripped him of both. His fall was not a single event but a cascading failure of every lie he had ever told. He lost his position at the consulting firm within 48 hours. The board of directors, many of whom had been at that dinner, could not distance themselves from a man accused of professional fraud and intellectual property theft fast enough. Elena, the young woman he had tried to mold into his next host, abandoned him before the sun rose the next morning. She sent me a brief stoic email thanking me for the mentorship before she disappeared from his life, taking her youth and her future with her, and leaving Julian to face the $300,000 debt alone. I heard through the grapevine that his family had stopped taking his calls, unable to stomach the shame of his public exposure. He tried to reach out to me, of course. My phone would light up with blocked numbers and desperate groveling voicemails at 3 a.m, Julian's voice cracking as he begged for a second chance or a loan to get back on his feet. I didn't listen to them. I simply deleted the files, blocked the numbers, and felt a profound sense of peace. He was blocked on every level, socially, financially, and digitally, becoming a non-entity in the very world he had tried so hard to conquer. While Julian was drowning in the wreckage of his own making, I was ascending. I didn't just return to my life, I expanded it. I took the capital I had recovered from the restructured wedding contracts and used it to launch the Miller Foundation, a luxury retreat and educational center for women navigating major life transitions. I practiced exactly what I preached, handling my own crisis with such absolute authority that my professional brand didn't just survive, it tripled in value. Clients didn't see me as a victim of a scandal. They saw me as the woman who had executed the most successful hostile takeover of her own happiness. My business became a beacon for women who wanted to learn how to lead their lives with the same strategic precision I had used to dismantle Julian. I began to travel not to escape my past, but to celebrate my present. I spent weeks in the south of France and the rugged coastlines of Italy, enjoying a peaceful, high-end lifestyle that was no longer anchored by the dead weight of a partner who didn't deserve me. I found that the air was thinner and clearer at the top, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't building a legacy for a we. I was building it for me. Looking back, the experience taught me a lesson that only a woman who has lived long enough to know better can truly appreciate. We are often taught that walking away is a sign of defeat, a white flag raised in the face of a battle we couldn't win. But I realized that walking away is actually the ultimate strategic relocation of one's energy. It is the act of deciding that your peace is worth more than their punishment. I didn't need to stay and argue with Julian. I didn't need to hear his apologies or see him beg for forgiveness. By the time I left that ballroom, I had already won because I had reclaimed the only thing that actually mattered: my certainty. I realized that the best revenge isn't a loud argument or a messy confrontation that leaves you feeling drained and small. The best revenge is living so exceptionally well with so much joy and professional success that the person who tried to break you becomes nothing more than a nameless ghost in your rearview mirror. Julian became a story I told to help other women, a case study in liability management, and eventually he became nothing at all. There is a specific kind of power that comes from knowing exactly when to stay silent and when to strike. My dignity was never in jeopardy because I never let Julian's actions dictate my worth. I watched him try to play a game of chess with a woman who owned the board the pieces in the room they were sitting in. He thought he was the architect of a new life, but he was merely a squatter in a house I had built. As I sit on my terrace today looking out at the horizon, I realize that the postponement he forced on me was the greatest gift he could have ever given. It gave me the time to see the truth, the space to plan my exit, and the clarity to realize that I never needed him to be whole. I am 38 years old. I am powerful. I am wealthy, and I am entirely free. The life I have now is far grander than any wedding could have provided because it is a life built on the truth of who I am, rather than the lie of who he wanted me to be. He postponed the wedding because he wasn't sure. I ended it because I was. Thank you for following Denise's journey from a moment of calculated betrayal to a triumph of absolute self-worth. Stories like this remind us that our dignity is a non-negotiable asset and that the most powerful move a woman can make is to choose herself when the world expects her to settle. If you found Denise's strategic resilience inspiring, or if you have ever had to find the strength to walk away from a situation that no longer served your value, we want to hear from you. Your experiences and insights are what make this community so incredibly strong and vibrant. Do you believe Denise's public exposure of Julian was the ultimate justice, or would you have handled the situation differently? Perhaps you have your own story of a graceful exit that led to a better life. Please share your thoughts and opinions in the comments below to help other women find their voice. If you enjoyed this high-stakes narrative of truth and transformation, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story of empowerment and justice. Your support allows us to continue bringing these powerful accounts of resilience to life. Remember that you are the architect of your own future, and it is never too late to rewrite your script.